Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm continuing my lecture series into race and ethnicity in America. We are on section 1.1 of my notes, which is page 4. All you need to do to access the notes is click the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF, download the PDF, and use it to supplement your reading. The reading is coming from Cornell West Reader. If you want to get the book, just click the link. It'll take you to Amazon, purchase the book. Otherwise, just use the notes to supplement your existing knowledge and your existing reading. So, with that, let's begin section 1.1. So this is and we're on section 1.1. Okay, so the genealogy of modern racism. We talked in the last section a bit about the history and the development of racism within the progression of Western education, Western philosophy, primarily talking about the influence of the nihilistic collapse in Europe and the sense of which the population at large was a bit underprepared for the consequences of scientific enlightenment. Obviously, the benefits of scientific enlightenment are too numerous to name, right? Science transformed everything. However, science didn't offer us a way of living morally. It didn't offer us a way of facilitating better social relations. And thus, while we made these huge strides in science, our social relations waned and regressed quite a bit. And the idea is to recognize the influence of our new formed national identity in the United States as still being wedded to a lot of the pre-existing tensions that occurred in Europe, right? So the example that I gave was we, the United States of America, were something like the adolescent child rebelling from mom or dad, right? Rebelling from the tradition that is European tradition, and we are setting out to establish a new identity for ourselves. And a lot of the tensions that arose within the formation of our national identity, and as a consequence of the indebtedness that the nation had to the mass extermination of Native Americans, coupled with the enslavement of the continent of Africa, for all practical purposes, resulted in complicating the existing tensions. There was a hypocrisy, right? While American men and women who had just liberated themselves under the auspice of equity and equality and freedom had finally gained the economic, social, religious advantages of being able to practice their beliefs, being able to live freely from what would otherwise be monarchical control or papal control. They too denied the African slave that same freedom, and thus we need to be continually cognizant of this inherent hypocrisy within our tradition as Americans. Why? Because the argument via West is that those hypocrisies still inform our social interaction. So that's sort of the wrap up. That's a super 2-minute tidy of section 1.0, and now we begin with section 1.1. So again, more into the genealogy, now specifically with respect to modern racism. So the genealogy is West's attempt to identify the emergence, or, quote, the moment of arising of the idea of white supremacy, right? The idea that propagated itself, being the Aryan race, the white race is the supreme race, right? It is the race for which the demarcations all aspire to, right? It is the pinnacle in terms of race-based theory. It is the pinnacle of all races. So the genealogy of Western, and not just Western, but modern racism has to begin with the idea of white supremacy, right? It's in the formulation of this idea. It's in the formulation of this, what will be propagated means of justifying segregation and marginalization and dehumanization and disenfranchisement of people. It's through the use of this idea that we see the tensions arise, and I mean, obviously, not even just tensions, I mean, mass wholesale destruction of people, I would say that is typified in the greatest genocide of them all, the Holocaust, obviously. So I don't want you to think that this is just contextualized within the context of sort of black-white relations. This is contextualized within all racial relations, with the white race being the supreme race, is the argument. So number one, the authority of science undergirded by a modern philosophy promotes and encourages the activity of observing, comparing, measuring, and ordering the physical characteristics of human bodies. And this is all a consequence of scientific enlightenment. So what we have in number one is, as a consequence of scientific enlightenment, right? As a consequence of scientific enlightenment, we have the recognition of a taxonomy. We have a recognition and emphasis placed on observation and empirical data, all of which facilitated the emergence of science as the reigning intellectual paradigm. Right? We move out of the Dark Age, we move out of a mystical era, we move away from the church and the control of the church to science as and to this day it still is the reigning paradigm for understanding. And I don't mean science necessarily just science proper, hard sciences, but science including social sciences. But science as a sort of science proper as a discipline is wedded to empirical observation. And all of the available tools used to facilitate empirical observation are wedded themselves to science. The argument is, look what happened with science. Look how powerful science became as a discipline for using and incorporating and placing emphasis on empirical observation, on data, on comparative and contrasting relationships and such. We, in the social sciences, should adopt a similar methodological approach to truth, right? We, in the social sciences, we as society, we as the political realm, should adopt a similar methodological approach. And while this all sounds, perfectly feasible, and there's nothing ominous about that inclination, the problem is, however, is that our social relations aren't conducive in many respects. Some respects, yes, but in many respects, the emphasis on empirical phenomena, the emphasis on observation is complicated by any number of social structures in place. And thus, what we end up having is an attempt to, as we have in science, to demarcate things, to label things, to identify things, to organize things, to, in the demarcation of things, to say that these things are better than these things, and such and such and such. Right? So that the idea is we inherit from science, more so I would say we probably borrow from science, this empirical emphasis, this empirical methodological approach to the observation of truth, to the recognition and uncovery of truth, to the social sciences. And what do? We try to do this to human beings. Better and worse human beings, smarter and less smart, more adaptable, less adaptable, and all of this informs and infiltrates our social science and the way in which we see the world. And this results in any number of atrocities. Again, from the justification of slavery to the, and remember, the initial slave trade was before, if you're thinking like 13th, I guess it's probably started 14th something, so about 15th century on. Scientific enlightenment takes its root about 16th, 17th century on. So you can see the influence, the transformation in the way in which socially we recognize people, we identify people as people. And unfortunately, the Second World War was really the keystone. It was the linchpin, if you will, that held together that white supremacist belief. It was the belief that in so far as these people, the Jews and others, gypsies and such, are not as superior as the Aryan white, all of this belief, the entirety of this belief, has to actualize itself in an attempt, a real attempt, to reduce the population, right, to eliminate the population, and thus Jews were systematically slaughtered in the millions, right? So I mean, I'm not saying anything that people don't already know. We already know that scientific enlightenment gave us a more empirical observation of the world, that informed social Darwinism and other pseudoscientific practices that led to the justification for exterminating millions of people. We know that, so there's no need to really belabor the point. So 1A, these practices were guided by an adherence to a new paradigm of knowledge. This is a direct quote. An experimental method that attempted to test hypotheses and yield objective conclusions by appealing to evidence and observation. Right? Again, I can't speak for Brother West. It's his text, but obviously the implication is this is not a bad thing. It's not that this is a bad thing. It's not that empirical observation and emphasis on objective conclusions and justifiable conclusions are a bad thing. It's not that reproducibility is a bad thing, but it undermined a lot of our social relationships by allowing for a justification to dehumanize others. So I think that's important. 1B, the undeniable power, and this power is a socio-political power, derives from scientific enlightenment. This is me writing now. For example, that's supposed to say sociality, increases in human longevity, etc. And I'll explain that. Politically, that's supposed to say socially, sorry. So socially, increases in human longevity, and politically, militarized, weaponized, fused weapons, weaponized social progress. What in the world am I writing here? The undeniable power, sociopolitically derived from scientific enlightenment. Okay, I see what I'm saying. So, two I can't understand my own writing. Two benefits derived from scientific enlightenment: social benefit, political benefit. Socially, the benefits from scientific enlightenment were increases in human longevity. This is how it's supposed to. It's not necessarily meant to be read as it is to trigger me what to say. So socially, what do we get? Increases in human longevity. Why? The discovery of bacteria, the discovery of viruses, the discovery of the importance of refrigeration and the purification of the things that we drink and the sterilization of any number of things, right? So in terms of the social impact of scientific enlightenment, we live longer as a consequence. So that's the first part. Politically, what are and this might be contentious in some way, but I mean, in terms of power, it's undeniable. Politically, we become more militarily powerful, right? So the militarization and the weaponization fused with weaponized social progress, right? What do we have as the benefits of scientific enlightenment? Well, we have automatic machine guns. We have tanks. We have grenades. We have any number of sort of defense mechanisms that we can use in fighting war, in protecting the homeland and such. And thus we have a much, much more effective means of perpetrating our national ideologies, right? Our national ideas. Insofar as our relationship with Nazi Germany, we're not going to allow the Nazis to just go out and wholesale kill. We come in, the United States of America comes in, and we put a cease to that conflict. But no one's going to deny that, especially when it comes to chemical weapons, their use of chemical weapons as informed by some of the discoveries that arose from scientific enlightenment, it becomes this tension, right? Science advances in science, fighting advances in science, right? Chemical weapons as one advance in science, needing us to combat that with new advances, right? So the idea is just, again, to recognize sort of historically how, and this is the first 1A was quoted directly from Brother West himself. The idea is to recognize initially now how these advances in science influenced socially, influenced politically. There are any number of other things in which they influenced, but I chose those two. And then last on page 4, this is 1C. West is arguing that the weaponization as manifested in racism, etc., and this is the social weaponization via social Darwinism and such, is inherent within the scientific process itself as an inevitable consequence of our fascination with Aristotelian taxonomy, identification, and hierarchical differentiations. All right, quite a bit of a mouthful. I'm sure I'm going to give you a citation in a little bit, and I do on the next page. So let's flip to the next page at top page 5, and let's just let's listen to this quote. So West's genealogical approach to modern racism is, quote, a conception of power that is subjectless. That is, they are the indirect product of praxis of human subjects. Okay, in terms of the inherency of racism, it isn't that science necessitates racism. I don't think he's saying that. Now, he'll have to speak for himself. I think what he's saying in this, and this is up for interpretation because it isn't as clear as probably one would like, but I think what Brother West is saying here is that the use of science it habituates the mind, it trains the mind to think scientifically, to see the world in terms of taxonomies, in terms of groups, in terms of classification. It causes us to rank things. It causes us to see demarcations and distinctions in things, all of which is good. I mean, my mind functions like this while I'm speaking. Fortunately or unfortunately, it's sort of hard to stay pinpoint focus when 90 things while you're thinking while you're speaking. It's weird. But fortunately, science tells us how to order things, right? I mean, that's one of the key things that science does. It tells us how to order things and structure things and how to identify new things. None of which is bad. Those characteristics are what has legitimized science as a discipline because it makes scientific discovery accessible to everyone, provided you have that same way of seeing the world. It's the way of seeing the world that gives you access to these amazing possibilities that science perpetually gives us. Now, so it's not that it's bad. I don't think Brother West, I know he's not saying that that is bad in and of itself. The misappropriation of those tools, the misappropriation of that way of seeing the world scientifically in terms of a very detached, objective, empirical observation and assessment of things is not conducive to our social relations, because our social relations need to factor in a lot more subjective interpretation. It needs to factor into emotional conditions, typifying and sort of culminating in empathy and sympathy. I'd say empathy more than sympathy if possible. None of which really can really be accounted for in science. It's not that science is incapable of doing it, it's that the tools of science and the products with science yields do not properly facilitate a lot of our social needs, and thus we need social scientists to do that. The idea is to make sure that social scientists are using the tools that they have readily available to them in the appropriate manner. And unfortunately, there is a tendency to borrow from the scientific method those aspects that facilitate scientific progress, but don't do so for social progress. And I think that's sort of the general lay of the land. Shouldn't be too difficult to understand. So top of page 5, number 3, discursive and non-discursive structures of power. This is, for me, pretty interesting, right? Sort of the demarcation between discursive and non-discursive conditions for power. So before I replicate the image on the board, let me just read this example, and I'll read all the way down to bullet point number 4. So, non-discursive structures create the conditions for the means of the preservation, propagation of socio-political power, right? So when we think about non-discursive power, it propagates, it emboldens, it stabilizes socio-political power. But keep in mind that these are non-discursive. It's something, those structures of power that are readily communicable. And as such, the means function to such end, right? Non-discursive structures of power establish, legitimize, propagate power, but the very condition for its establishment is that which is not discussed. I know this seems a little, and these concepts and these words aren't my own, right? These aren't my own. And I'll explain what that means in a second. So I just want you to just think non-discursive, can't discuss. But it facilitates in the establishment of power. So on a sort of ghetto philosophy, those things that aren't really discussed, that facilitate power, is kind of the ghetto way of understanding this. Okay. The idea of discursive, right, pertains to the epistemic accessibility to the means of power. That's, we can describe, we can articulate, we can come to understand the means with which power is fortified. But not, or less so, to the conditions for those means. So I'll give you an example, and I think this is a great example. So Edward Bernays, I believe he was the cousin of Freud, or the nephew of Freud. He was related to Freud in some way. I'd read his work, very thin book, I mean, you can read it in like 2-3 days, on propaganda, right, maybe a year, 2 years ago, and I was fascinated by his approach. It's just like the pre-PR. He's like the pre-public relations guru. A lot of his research has been used in marketing and public relations and stuff, but the truth of it, I'm not going to get into sort of the implications of propaganda here. It wouldn't be appropriate, but it's much, much deeper than just marketing and propaganda. So there's a bacon and egg example, and you can click the link, and it'll take you, who I believe is Bernays, I don't know for a fact, but it'll take you to the description of how this sort of bacon and egg example works. So go watch it, come back. I already know the example. I'm assuming, I'll pause for a second and allow you to go watch the video, so pause it, go watch the video, it's like 2 minutes. Okay, I'm assuming you watched the video, so I'll assume under that assumption to start the explanation within the context of the bacon and egg example. So, non-discursive structures of power, that is, with relative epistemic inaccessibility. So, the meat industry, right, slaughterhouses, and chicken farms would all operatively function as non-discursive structures of power if we're talking about the meat industry. So how does this work? You can imagine in a contemporary setting that I say, hey, I want to be able to sell more bacon and egg, right? This is 2 meat products, right? 2 protein products. So I want to sell more bacon and eggs. But I don't know how to sell more bacon and eggs because, you know, we're still wedded to sort of the European tradition. And in Europe, a lot of breakfast is like jam, toast, and something to drink. I want to get rid of jam, toast, and something to drink because that's European. We're trying to do it American. And what do Americans eat? We eat bacon and egg. However, think about a time before us eating bacon and egg. I can't seem to get people to eat bacon and egg. What in the world can we do? Okay. We recognize that in serving bacon and egg every day, and continually going back to purchase these products, that is, bacon and egg as product, then this is going to fortify an industry, right? Our habit of eating bacon and eggs at breakfast every day fortifies sort of the meat industry, the people who own the bacon factories, the people who own the egg companies, blah, blah, blah. And they probably, one and the same person probably owns both. Now, there shouldn't be any rocket science to that. It should be super simple. What's important to recognize is that your habit of purchasing bacon and eggs makes me wealthy. We'll just keep it really ghetto, really simple. I don't want to get into political stuff, but just on a really super simple level, I hope this is simple, that your habit, if I can create a habit, and your habit then of eating bacon and egg in the morning, is just going to continually make me rich. Okay, so imagine now that we're going to equate my wealth with power, right? So that I could say that your habit would then facilitate my power. That should make sense. Okay. Part of your habit is contingent on those factors that allow for your habit. And those factors that allow for your habit is a slaughterhouse, which you'll never see, right? Unless you're watching some pedo video, right? You're never going to see it. I've been alive for 38 years that I have yet to ever drive by a slaughterhouse. Maybe I did drive by and didn't know what it was, but I've never seen one in my life, right? So it's a slaughterhouse, which you won't see. But that slaughterhouse serves as the condition for your habituation, to be technical, right? Now we're getting deeper. But this entity, this thing, facilitates a habit that you now have. If I get rid of the slaughterhouse, you can't have the bacon, right? So the thing that you don't even discuss, the things that's never identified, facilitates in my power. And one example of that, it's a non-discursive structure. The non-discursive structure for the habituation of your routine would be a slaughterhouse in this example. But we don't discuss that. What do we discuss? We go to the second. Discursive structures. Why? Why is it important? Discursive structures of power, as it means, create, in this example, the ability to answer the question why. Why is it important to have a good breakfast? Discursive structures are what I employ Bernays for. Bernays, hire a couple of doctors, tell the doctors, make sure that it's legit, that protein builds good, you know, it's good for your hair, it's good for your skin, it's good for your muscles, it's good for your brain. having a good breakfast will help you perform better in school. I can tell you this as a fact. You know, trying to get up first thing in the morning and take a test on an empty stomach, it's not good. It's not a good. Actually, is this race? I might talk about. You know, I never talked about nutrition. I probably should have talked about nutrition. I just thought about that. But no, nutrition is huge. Like, you want to get up, you want to eat a good breakfast, you want to make sure if you're sitting down to take a test that you're full. And sometimes, you know, this is America. You know, toast and jam and orange juice is not going to cut it. So eat bacon and eggs for breakfast, right? We can talk about that, why you should eat a well-balanced breakfast in the morning, why your breakfast should have bacon and eggs on the plate. All of these things give me access, epistemological access, to the conditions that justify my habituation, right, to be technical. Right? All of these things give me access to those conditions that justify my habituation. Insofar as I have access, insofar as I have knowledge, I can talk about why I should. Now, one thing with movements like PETA that's so profoundly radical is PETA wants to argue why you shouldn't. Well, you shouldn't do it because what? And then you watch the PETA videos. We've all seen them, right? It's like, here's a slaughterhouse. Here's what it looks like. This is why you should not. What PETA is attempting to do is take those non-discursive structures and transform non-discursive structures into discursive structures. Those things that we don't have any access to, that we don't have any knowledge to, and make them the topic of conversation. And, you know, that's a tough gig. That's a really tough gig. As I said, I'm older and I haven't in my life ever seen it, so I don't know how we would go about discussing it. And then when you watch the videos, you're like, you know, this is really graphic. I don't know that I want to even watch this. But you get the idea now. I think it should be clear. Okay, so what I want to do then is I want to take this idea of discursive and non-discursive, and I won't go too deep because this is a public lecture, but in terms of discursive and non-discursive structures, both structures, discursive and non-discursive, facilitate habituation and fortify the expansion and propagation of existing power. And that should make sense now. Discursive structures are those structures in which, I have to crack my nail, sorry, with my finger. Discursive structures are those conditions in which as a population, access to the conditions that fortify power are readily available epistemically. We can readily talk about any number of factors that facilitate in a relationship of power. Non-discursive structures are those aspects that facilitate power that are not discussed for any number of reasons. The idea that they don't participate in functional power is false. It's just that you don't know of their participation. You don't know how these things function in power. And there might be any number of reasons which I won't discuss why, and I might be biased. So another professor might give you another take and say everything should be discursive. I personally don't believe that. I do believe there should be some aspect. I mean, I don't want my little girl knowing, I don't want my little boy knowing that the bacon that you're eating, this is what's going on. No. We're not vegetarians, and insofar as we're not vegetarians, you gotta eat, and, you know, this job has to function. Do I want my kids knowing that? Not necessarily. You can think about your own personal life in relationship with your own children. You don't want your children knowing everything that you do. You don't want your children knowing how the bills are paid or the stresses that you might be under. You try to protect them and insulate them from the stresses of daily life. And this might be a good thing or a bad thing, but the idea is, it might be paternalistic, some might argue, that's fine. But in terms of the establishment of your dominance in your family, as mom, as dad, clearly there are some things that you don't have as a topic for discussion with the children, and there are other things which the children are invited to discuss and partake in. So I think that's the general bit. I could take that a lot deeper, but given the context of the lecture and the ton of information I still have to cover before this section is concluded, I'll stop there. So number 4 then. Number 4. This is me. This is a key point, right? In applying what West has said, though he does not say this directly, since the genealogy of modern racism is, quote, a conception of power that is subjectless, right? There is no subject. It's the manifestation of power, and it utilizes itself, and not utilizes, but it implements itself through our practices. It's not through an individual body. That is, the indirect product of praxis of human subjects, but affects subjects, discursive structures, the discursive structures pertain to the observable, quantifiable, empirically observable racism. The non-discursive structures, however, are those consequences of scientific enlightenment that allow for and justify, albeit indirectly, observable racism. Okay, what in the world does that mean? Think of it like this. We have racism, right? So we'll say other two, no, it's just one. Slur, that's a shame. I think slur has one R. That's a shame. So someone wields a racist slur, right? Somebody calls another person a nigger. Like calls them any number of racist slurs, right? So person one calls person two a racist slur. In terms of the slur itself, right? So we'll say, let's say nigger. In terms of the term itself, nigger. Nigger is accessible, A-C-C-E-S. It's accessible epistemically. We can epistemologically access the context of this term. We know what this means, and thus we could talk about it. Thus, nigger is part of the discursive space, right? Obviously. Nigger is part of the discursive space. It's part of our, and I don't mean physical space, but part of the social relations that allow for, this is a perfect way of saying it, it's part of our social relations that allow for its intelligibility. It can be understood, right? So you can imagine that someone comes to the U.S., someone's learning English. This probably happens all the time, I would imagine. Someone's learning English for the first time, don't know any English at all, happen to find themselves hanging with sort of younger, millennial, maybe even Gen X African Americans, and hear the word nigger used, right? And think to themselves, oh well, you know, this is a saying that people use, and you know, they might tell them, hey, don't use this saying in this context, but blah blah blah. But they can come to understand the use of this word. They can then even understand that some members of this group can use it, but other members of the other group can't use it. The justification for why or why not, I'm not really interested in it at all here, but you can understand that, okay, yes, black people can use it among themselves, justifiable or not. White people can't use it amongst themselves, or maybe amongst themselves is fine, but not to another black person, okay? So they start to understand the rules of the game, if you will, as arbitrary and as convoluted and as capricious as they are. But the very fact that it can be understood, the very fact that the context with which the meaning of what's being said can be understood, it facilitates this discursive space. Okay. Part of the non-discursive space, right? Part of the non-discursive space is that the evocation of the term, if it's used pejoratively, if it's used to dehumanize and demean, the evocation of the term itself is a manifestation of power. To use the term, I have to be careful with, because I know this is public, so that might be a bit of a stretch for a public lecture, but also I'll just stick with this. The use of the term is done to establish dominance. It's done to establish power. Of course I recognize that insofar as I use this, I goad the other person to either attack me or to harm me, and then use that as a justification for violence, or I goad the other person into calling me a racial slur, and then we go back and forth. But it is ridiculous to think that someone doesn't use this term with the intent of offending and harming another person without recognizing that the use of that term establishes dominance, it establishes power. It is sending the individual the signal that you aren't like me, you aren't as good as me, you aren't to be recognized like I am, you are not to be considered morally, you're a nigger, and I'm not. All that we have in terms of the non-discursive use, not just the use, the non-discursive function that facilitates the non-discursive structure that facilitates the use, right? The non-discursive structure that facilitates the use is a genealogy. It's the history of why, right? Why is it the case that the use of that term has historically led to violence? Why is it the case that the use of this term has historically led to aggression and da-da-da-da-da-da? What ends up happening, and this is pretty interesting, is you have to, rap music, I'm having a sort of love-hate affair with rap in my contemporary sort of lived experience now. Grew up on rap, loved rap for years. I can't really deal with rap anymore. It's great, it's fun, it's a little too dumbed down, it's a little too violent just for the sake of just violence. And I like aggressive stuff because sometimes you need to get pumped up. But like on a regular Tuesday, you don't need to be hearing all of this, and I just can't get access to rap like I used. I'm starting to fall out of love with it, and it's part of my generation, part of my age. I'm sure I'm starting to grow up, and rap isn't. Rap is for young people, so I got to move on. Why did I bring up rap? Because there was a recognition in my generation, in Generation X, that we could transform the meanings. Right? We could take the non-discursive structures. Right? We could take the non-discursive structures, making nigger potent as a term, and transform the non-discursive structures so the use changed. Now, how does this work? Well, you have to recognize that, and I don't want to go too deep into semiotics and semiotic theory and the linguistic community, but there is a community who is using this term, the term nigger. And if it was the case that we never, in a previous time, like in the civil rights movement, that blacks would less likely use the term amongst themselves, then almost exclusively the only time that the term would be used is in its pejorative sense. Whites saying it to blacks as a means of dehumanizing and disrespecting members of the African American community. So that the only time it surfaced, the use of the term surfaced in our social practices was in this relation of dominance. What did we recognize? Hip-hop recognized, whether justly or not, that we could use the term ourselves. That we could use the term to refer to each other. Now, some people have problems with this. I'm not getting into the ethics of this. I'm just talking about transforming discursive into non-discursive structures, non-discursive structures into discursive structures. In a previous era, we didn't talk about that. You wouldn't say the word nigger. Right? If you said the word nigger as a black person, what are you calling him a nigger? You can't do that. There is no space, there's no social space that allows for the use of this term. Thus, the only time it's ever used socially is to reaffirm instances of power and domination, and thus the evocation of the term was always contextualized, or almost always contextualized within that context. Thus, the term gets a very toxic, a very violent, a very sort of ominous tone. What do? We recognize it's precisely because we're not using the term, that the term is non-discursive, that it is something that we're not even willing, we African Americans are not even willing to evoke. It's something that we're not willing to discuss, that gives the term its potency, and thus we transformed this the non-discursive characteristics of the term nigger by saying it amongst ourselves now. Thus, when it pops up in our practices, social practices now, contemporarily, it's probably overwhelmingly the case that it's blacks saying it to other blacks. What's up, my nigga? What you doing, nigga? Da-da-da. I'm getting older now, so it doesn't really sound as like it would when I was younger. It's funny how quickly you start to get to the tail end of your 30s and everything changes. 5 years ago, probably fine, but even now, it doesn't even sound right. But I remember, not too long ago, that I would be completely comfortable saying that, right? That's not a problem. Why? Because what we've done, if you think about it, is we've taken the fact that it isn't something that we talk about, and thus we don't have epistemological access to. You don't have epistemic access to the things that you're not discussing, and we started using it a lot. Our use of the term created social discussion on the use of the term, and that social discussion on the use of the term made this non-discursive structure that facilitated the power of oppression. It weakened it. 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 And now, it's still not appropriate to say it, but it wouldn't be as violent and hostile as it was before. Is that good? Is that bad? I'm not here to describe. I'm not here to say. I'm not here to assess. What's important is your recognition between both instances of discursive and non-discursive structures facilitating power, the power that was facilitated by the non-discursive use of the term nigger facilitated sort of white supremacy. Because the only time it was ever discussed, the only time it was ever used, was among those who knew they could weaponize the term and use it as a means of provocation, as a means of debasement, as a means of what have you. Now that it's being used, the power that it facilitates, I wouldn't go so far as to say the use of the term facilitates an empowerment. Maybe not that, I wouldn't say that. But it has definitely destabilized its toxicity, its potency as a means of debasing individual character. Which is why you'll have somebody will say, oh, well, you're a nigger. You say, yeah, but I'm not sure if you know this acronym, right? HMIC. They say, oh, you're a nigger? You're like, yeah, I'm a nigger, but I'm the head nigger in charge. Right? Yeah, I'm a nigger, but I'm the head nigger in charge. So that the idea of being a nigger isn't, it doesn't have the same, like someone that'll call you a nigger, you're just like, wow, look how ignorant this dude is. Like he really, you immediately associate that use, especially by a white person, with low socioeconomic status, for right or wrong, low education for right or wrong, just sort of impoverished mind, right? Do you really think that that was going to provoke me into getting an argument with you or fight with you? No, you just showed me how dumb you are, right? That's where we've come. In a different time, maybe a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, definitely 2 decades ago, and more, the use of that term would have led to conflict. And obviously race-based conflict between blacks, whites, Hispanics, whites, Jews. It's part of what it is. It's part of our relationship as human beings in the States or otherwise, right? I'm not naive enough to believe that we'll ever get away from the tensions in its use. I'm not here to say whether you can or can't use it. White people use it, fine. Black people use it, fine. It's a recognition of the way in which we transform the meaning and the significance of its use socially. And to allow something to be discussed, to bring it into light, means that you have more knowledge of what that thing is, obviously, right? If you don't know what the thing is, whatever it is, it could be the use of this term, it could be anything. If you don't have access to what something is, there's no means for us to discuss it because I can't even comprehend it. It's incomprehensible. To bring it into light is to take that which was not discussed, non-discursive, and to make it discussed. And it will transform the very act of bringing it into light, whatever it is, transforms power, right? It transforms power, both facilitating power, but it will transform the way in which power manifests. So the ability to dehumanize and disparage an individual based on the use of this term, it's still there, but it's now weakened, right? It has transformed. That power has gone somewhere else. I would argue, since it's balanced, and a lot of people have problems with it, that the power in the use of that term went to the people who use the term now most frequently, which is the African American community, and it's just like any other term now. It's completely lost its significance. Of course, another term might arise at some point in the future, but that's neither here nor there. So I think a relatively sort of technical discussion, but hopefully that helped. So let's look at the bottom of page 5 and look at this image, right? So we have the scientific method informing biological racism. So the scientific method becomes the conditions for which we can talk about and operationalize biological racism. And we've been talking about this since the beginning of the lecture, right? West says that it is through the scientific method and the advances in scientific enlightenment that we collectively recognize we could posit white supremacy and justify white supremacy by reference to biological racism, biological supremacy, right? So we borrow those aspects, those objective criteria, we make our distinctions on any number of things, I'll talk about this soon, to legitimize white supremacy and thus biological racism. So top of page 6. So the scientific method functions as the non-discursive structure that has indirectly created the conditions for, quote-unquote, justifying the discursive structures of biological racism. So in relation to this, the scientific method is largely non-discursive. Why? Because the general population, excuse me, because the general population don't have epistemic access to the function and the methodological use of the scientific method. Scientists get on TV. Hi, I'm in the lab coat. I'm scientist XYZ from da-da-da, and I'm here to let you know X. Okay, are her credentials legitimate? Sure, it's X. Right? Now, granted, I'm talking about the general population, and this also isn't to disrespect or to sort of, what is the word I'm looking for? Not just disrespect. This isn't to trivialize. This isn't to trivialize the transference of information from the intelligentsia to the population, but that's basically how it works. I'm Dr. X, I say it's this, the population buys into it because I'm Dr. X, right? So what's being discussed? Whatever Dr. X is discussing, right? Whatever is, and you know, there's an actual amazing, it's funny that I said X because I would have never thought of this. This is actually genius now that I think about it. Google, go to Yahoo, not Yahoo, go to YouTube and type in the Dr. Fox speech, F-O-X speech, and this is a perfect example of, and I should have put it here, discursive and non-discursive structures of power. So Dr. Fox comes in, he says that I think he professes to be a psychiatrist, and he talks all of this sort of psychobabble, mumbo-jumbo, and everybody believes him because he's you know, did I talk about Sokol in this page? I would imagine, yeah, Sokol Affairs down here too. So yeah, I see a template now. So Dr. Fox comes in, and he talks all this psychobabble, and everybody sort of buy into the psychobabble of Dr. Fox. Why? Because he says, hi, I'm Dr. Fox. What the population is doing is they're appealing to the credentials of Dr. Fox, right? So they appeal to his credentials. Now, the difference between me and Dr. Fox is that I give you the method, right? You have, which is what I think makes me very unique on YouTube, is I'm not just lecturing. I'm giving you my notes, right? I don't keep this for myself. I don't keep my notes to myself. Typically, it's the case that professors never give their notes, right? You go to teach a class, you keep your notes, you change them as the years go by, you lecture, but you keep your notes to yourself. Me, I give you the method, so you can see how I came up with this idea or what my train of thought might have been and reconstruct because you have notes. But imagine that you didn't. You just have to take what I say for face value. But you're going to make that appeal to my know-how. My know-how in relationship to your knowledge is non-discursive. Right? I don't tell you how I came about it. You just appeal to my authority, and thus the conditions that facilitate the process of me knowing is non-discursive. I have it, you don't. What you have is whatever I'm communicating. So I say this, da-da-da-da. The question to say, well, Dr. Campbell, how did you arrive at this conclusion means that you don't know. It hasn't yet been communicated. You don't have epistemic access. How did you arrive at X is a type of question that warrants, not even warrants is not strong enough, that necessitates. How did you arrive at X necessitates the articulation of that which is non-discursive. I have to go about and give you some access to the methodology by which I arrived at X. How did you arrive at the belief that, you know, Mary told Bob this? Well, I checked something and, I found the email and, I saw her speak to him at the cafe, blah, blah, blah. Oh, okay, now I understand how. So the idea is, in terms of scientific method, why is this important? How does this relate to race? In terms of scientific method, the average person doesn't know how. They don't know how to. They understand maybe generally, hypothesis, testing, reproducibility, validation, blah, blah, blah. They sort of get a general understanding of science, but that's the extent of it. They don't know how science does what it does. Unfortunately, that still is overwhelmingly the case, right? Social scientists need to help out here. Overwhelmingly, people don't understand science. They don't know how. So they just make the appeal to science. What ends up happening if people make that appeal, what you're going to be doing is creating a straw. It's called a straw man. Straw man arguments. And a straw man argument is, it's not even a paraphrase. It's a caricature of the real know-how. It's a caricature of the real methodology. It's a caricature of the real structure. So that the scientific method has this structure, and I don't know how the scientific method implements that structure. But I know part of this is that it orders things. And I know part of this is that it says that this thing is better or more dominant, or it's more adaptable than this thing. and I just take the little bit that I can understand, not the know-how, but just a little bit that can be discussed, that can be articulated, and then I apply that to our social interactions. That is a perversion, obviously, of the scientific method. In defense, I would be defending the scientific method then in this instance, but that would be a perversion of the scientific method, because what you're doing is you're taking an aspect, a component part, and making a generalization as though this component part that's being generalized is the whole methodology, and it's not. Okay, so the scientific method then functions as the non-discursive structure, which should make sense now, that has indirectly created the conditions for justifying the discursive structures, that should make sense, of biological racism, as the means of securing and propagating the end. The end is socioeconomic political power. So we use these straw man arguments, these pseudo-scientific arguments, borrowed from science, and use it and implement it socially so that we can preserve power, so that groups can remain subordinated, so that other groups can feel empowered and entitled, and thus the inherency of the social conflict between any number of races, one inherency will always be based on the misappropriation of scientific fact. Right? People who don't really understand science, trying to speak science, they undermine our social relations by propagating misinformation, right? It's the propagation of misinformation in terms of science, which is why I don't talk about physics at all. I love physics, all I watch is like the physics stuff, but you will never, ever, 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 never hear me sit down and talk about physics because I'm not a physicist, right? I think, yo, you have credentials, oh, so you're a biologist and you're talking about physics, or, oh, you're this, you're a metaphysician, you talk about, oh, no, I'm not interested in that discussion because I'd rather get my physics from the physicists. When it comes to social sciences, I talk about that. Why? Because I know how, and I can communicate that know-how, at least in part, by offering notes, by sort of taking you through the way in which my brain has ordered and justified this. And sometimes people disagree with me. They tell, hey, Dr. Campbell, you're flat wrong. You're flat out wrong on this point. You didn't quite get this concept right, and so on and so forth. Right? I put myself out to be judged when I do these videos. So I think that should be clear, right? Scientific methodology now, a little bit deeper, functioning as a non-discursive structure of power, the use of biological racism as a discursive structure of power, both of which I would say scientific, the misappropriation of scientific knowledge, both of which, in that sense, used to quote-unquote justify, it's not a real justification, racism and dominance and racial antagonism. So I'm going to pause there for a second and then finish up these three structures of modern discourse, and then we'll move on. Okay, so top of page 6 of my notes, three structures of modern discourse. So I'm going to talk about these three structures in this section. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you a very, very general theoretical overview of the importance, and this all comes from West himself, why he selected it. Because if you're not, I mean, all of my education, I'm sort of loyal to philosophy, loyal to everything, but I got my BA in philosophy, my MA in philosophy, my PhD all in philosophy, so I understand. I was very, very surprised that West, and I do love this about his writing style, he has a very, very, very broad understanding, very general understanding, which is hard. It sounds like it's easy, it's not. He's a very general understanding of the history of Western philosophy and the implications of philosophy to science, to psychology, sociology, and he incorporates the philosophical tradition heavily in his writing as a means of guiding us through the progression in Western thought. Western thought is established in philosophy, and as we progress, philosophy is always there in the background. More than less and less. Psychology is its own discipline now. Physics is its own discipline now. It's no longer part of philosophy, but philosophy is still in the background, informing. I think now more than ever, it'll probably be more ethics and moral theory, bioethics and all that other stuff. Ethics in terms of war, just war theory, all that other stuff. There's tons of stuff that philosophers can contribute contemporarily, but obviously philosophy is in the back burner, as it should be. And I say this as a professional philosopher. I think what West does geniusly, and I would never have. It would be interesting, to talk to him and be like, "Well, how did you come up with this?" And you'll see what I'm referencing in a few seconds. Is the following three categories, like, what was it about these three criteria that you saw one single narrative? How did you take these three categories that were otherwise not connected and connect them? I want to know his know-how. I want him to take that non-discursive structure and make it discursive so I could use it, so I can use it better in my own writing. I wouldn't mind emulating that ability in his writing. He's got a very sort of accessible writing. You think that, this is very sort of historical in general, until you understand what it is that he's doing, and you're like, oh, wow, okay, that's deep. So let me explain this. I only have this half page left. The next page is the next section. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but there's a lot here. Despite its seeming brevity, there's a lot here. So let me erase this so that we can begin. All right, so three structures of modern discourse, and this comes from West himself. I understand the structures of modern discourse, right? I understand. So immediately we're in discursive space, right? I understand, which means it's all epistemically accessible. I understand the structures of modern discourse to be the controlling metaphors. I mean, you could just stop right there. You could just stop right there. I understand the structures of modern discourse to be the controlling metaphors, right? The way in which we tell ourselves a story. This is very Nietzschean, right? The way in which we tell ourselves a story, right? Notions, categories, and norms that shape the predominant conceptions of truth and knowledge in the modern West, which are determined by three historical processes. So before we move on, what is he saying? He's saying that there are metaphors, notions, categories, and norms that shape. What do they shape? They shape the truth. So their structures, we're going to consolidate metaphors, notion, categories, and norms. We're going to consolidate those into social structures. Right? Social structures, and what do these social structures do? They shape. And what are they shaping? They're shaping truth. So social structures are the sufficient condition for which we shape truth. Truth is necessitated, right? Truth is necessitated. Thus, we have a relationship like this. And this is an interesting approach, right? This isn't wholly wedded to West. He gets this template. It's a methodological. It is a methodological application of Gadamer. Gadamer talks a lot about this, right? And others. And the idea is science is but one. I think I talked about it. I've been doing so many lectures in the past month. I don't even remember which lecture it was that I talked about this. I want to say it was maybe my nationalism lecture. I forget which lecture. Or maybe it could be this lecture, where science is but one vehicle to truth. Science is not. No scientist, no credible scientist would say that science is the exclusive vehicle for which it's the exclusive means by which we arrive at truth. That's completely false. Part of the implosion, or the nihilism that resulted from the scientific Enlightenment in Europe was the assumption that there is only one, sort of dogmatically stated, there's only one vehicle for truth, right? First it used to be the church, and the church said it was just the church. Then the assumption, well, it's not the church because science is proving things that the church could never prove, and thus it's science. That also led to nihilism, just like the church led to nihilism. The realization now is that, no, science is in bed with the rest of us, right? It's science, it's social science, it's cognitive theory, it's psychological relationships, it's social dynamics, it's criminality, it's everything. It's everything that you can get at college, university. Any university class that you can get, the discipline that allows for that class has some claim to truth. Why is this important? So that we don't implode, so that we don't arrive at a nihilism. And it's not just a personal nihilism. We're talking about national nihilism. We're talking about continent-based nihilism. That nihilism manifested in the greatest atrocity of the last few centuries, right? If not the greatest atrocity, one of the greatest atrocities of all time, which was the The Holocaust. I mean, the Holocaust is a consequence. It is the culmination. The Holocaust is the culmination of European nihilism. So nihilism is nothing to play around with. It's really nothing to play around with. People are wedded to their beliefs. And when every belief that they have collapses, I'm here to tell you, when every belief that you have collapses, it's hard to function, right? You don't believe, you can't appreciate how wedded we are to our beliefs until you recognize that you have no belief in anything. And I don't mean atheism. This is so far beyond that. This is so far beyond that. You don't have belief in anything. In your nation, you have no belief in God, you have no belief in family, you have no belief in anything. There's nothing there. We are designed biologically, if you want to take a religious tradition, or we have evolved to be social. Whether or not you're Christian or religious or atheist, we both agree, theists and non-theists agree that we're social. And when there is no connection to anything, it can absolutely destabilize. It can. It's very, very, very profound. Now magnify that infinitely, manyfold, and you have an entire national or continent nihilism. Nobody believes. Well, what do you end up doing? The only thing that we have left, mass extermination, right? There's nothing to believe in, so what are we going to do? It's just power. It's just, they're the problem for all of our consequences. They were the ones who stole our faith, our belief. They are the ones that took our money, that took our livelihood, that took you put in your favorite blank, and it's terrible, right? So that these social structures, they shape truth, they shape knowledge. In the West, which are determined by three historical processes, right? So part of this truth, before we get to it, right? Truth being sort of the culmination, is determined by three processes. One, scientific revolution. So I'll put it over here. Two, Cartesian philosophy. And three, the classical revival. Okay, so we have scientific revolution, Cartesian philosophy, classical revival. This is for those of you who are academics, I like to do meta theory. I never talk about this. I was going to do a lecture series on it. I got the book. It's around here somewhere on meta-analysis. And I don't know if it would be appropriate to do a meta-analysis lecture publicly, but I'm absolutely fascinated with analyses of analyses. Because I would love to be like, West, how in the world did you find these? I believe him, now that he's articulated it, that we're going to connect the scientific revolution with Cartesian philosophy and classical revival. But the way that his brain is structured to wire that narrative is amazing to me. And I'm good at this stuff, I would have never... Scientific revolution and Cartesian philosophy with classical revival, which is an aesthetical bit, like, wow, like how did you do that? I would want to know how. To hear him, West, say, Colonel West, say, Jason, well, this is how I did it. Don't you see that this would not only give me access to the way in which he thinks, the method in which he thinks, it would also open up a whole new well, I don't want to get into all this, but it would open up a whole new justificatory process. He justified the connection of the scientific revolution with Descartes' Cartesian philosophy because of this, and I don't know what that is. Usually I can figure this out, but for this, and I've done a lot of lecture series, for this is one of the first times that I can connect it, I can present it, but I would still like to know why more. I still want to know more. And I think part of the fact that I'm contextualizing this within discursive structures and non-discursive structures just makes me want to know more anyway, right? You always want to know, when you know that you don't know, you want to know, right? And I know that I don't know, so obviously I want to know. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present it generally here, and in the next sections I'm going to give you concrete, contemporary examples, and weave a narrative that connects all three of the contemporary examples, which legitimizes West's account, right? If I was unable to do that, his account would have been less well sort of structured, or maybe it was a deficiency on my part, but with relatively easily applying these three criteria, I was able to identify contemporary misuses of power in the propagation of racism via scientific revolution, via Cartesian philosophy, via classical revival, and I'll talk about that in the next section. So, number one, the scientific revolution signified the authority of science, and B, highlights two fundamental ideas, observation and evidence. There really isn't that much to go into. I spent the whole first maybe 45 minutes discussing this already. I don't want to sort of belabor the point. We've identified the influence and the way in which the misappropriation of scientific methodologies and tools adversely affect our social relations. So that's number one. Number two, very interesting, Cartesian philosophy. So this is 2A, middle of page 6. West says, Descartes is highly significant because his thought provided the controlling notions of modern discourse, the primacy of the subject and the preeminence of representation. The primacy of the subject and the preeminence of representation. Okay, I'm not going to do a full-blown Cartesian sort of philosophy. Please, I already have a lecture series up. You know, the cool thing about this YouTube channel is that my mania sort of inclines me to just keep doing this because it has social value and it occupies my time and I learn a lot more. And all of my sort of neural interconnections just get deeper, so it's a bit of a buzz for me to do this. Literally, I mean that. But what's cool about it is now I can reference stuff that I've done in the past. So, go watch my video on Descartes' methodological skepticism. Just type in Descartes in my search box. It's probably like an hour worth of video. And you can see what the significance of this statement is in more detail. I don't have the time here to go into this, but I'm going to try and spend about 5 minutes on explaining this one line, right? The primacy of the subject and the preeminence of representation. So, first of all, we'll do the primacy of the subject for Descartes. Descartes offers the cogito, C-O-G-I-T-O. Look it up, it's very simple, you probably know it already. The cogito ergo sum is I think, therefore I am. It's not proper translation, but I think, therefore I am is the general translation that most people use. So insofar as I think, I recognize the I in this is the subject, right? So that we have at its base a thinking subject. And the thinking subject it's like space-time. You can't have subject without thinking, without thought. You can't have thought without subjectivity. Thus, you can make the claim that thought is the condition for subjectivity, which is key. Right? Thought is the condition for subjectivity. Thus, what we have is we're placing emphasis. We're emphasizing. Right? I think he says the preeminence, the primacy of the subject. Right? The primacy of the subject is constituted and legitimized by the ability for the subject to think. It's in the process of thought that I exemplify my subjectivity. And I happen to like this as a philosopher, right? It's through thinking. It doesn't have to be, higher order thinking. But in the process of thinking, what we arrive at in the cogito, and this is a huge generalization of the process of methodological skepticism, so that there's a process that allows for us to arrive at the cogito. It's called methodological skepticism. And the idea is it's skepticism as applied through method. It isn't just being skeptical of things. Oh, I don't quite believe this. Or, oh, you got to show me this. I think being skeptical is a great way to live your life, right? Yeah, you can have faith in things, sure. There's nothing wrong with that. But for those things that require evidence, be skeptical until the evidence is provided. Well, is this really the case? I'm going to wait and see. I'm not going to make my assessments until I have more information. So skepticism in its sort of colloquial sense is a good practice. It really is a good practice. Methodological skepticism is to take that skeptical inclination and to make it a process, right? To formalize it through any number of processes. And what he does is Descartes begins, and this is critically important. This is critically important. Descartes begins the process of methodological skepticism by questioning empirical reality, by questioning his beliefs. Could I be misinformed? Could I be misled? Could my body be lying to me? And of course we can, right? And you recognize any number of factors, So he takes this idea of being misled, being misinformed, and he brings it to, he applies it to the most fundamental concept of self that he can have. And that most fundamental concept is, even if everything is a lie, sort of the Matrix, then insofar as everything else is a lie, there is one truth that I know independent to this ocean of lies, that I am. Someone is constructing an entire world of lies. But irrespective of the fact that all of this is fabricated, that all this perception is fake, there is still a reality because it all refers to me. I wouldn't know of this external reality, fake or otherwise, without me having access, epistemic access to the things out there. So whether the things out there are true or not is irrelevant. The fact that I have access to that information, to stuff outside of me, necessitates me. And that's sort of the gross generalization of Descartes' cogito. So we put emphasis and, what's the word he uses? Primacy on the subject. Why? Because our minds are the things with which we access the external world. Scientists and psychologists, sociologists, and philosophers have known this for basically ever, since well, not forever. We've really recognized it and emphasized it more, especially in Western systems, now more than ever. So the subject becomes very, very important, right? The import and the role of subjective identity becomes huge in terms of the West. This isn't the case. It's almost precisely the opposite case in the East. It's more about the collective, or maybe even the disassociation of subjectivity. But in the West, it's all about subjectivity, which translates contemporarily into maybe individuality as a perversion of the idea. And the preeminence of representation. In terms of this representation, as I was saying before, what is being represented to the subject, at least theoretically, initially in the deconstructive phase, what's being represented to the subject is illusion. But even in the representation of illusion, which corresponds with Immanuel Kant's conception of phenomena, right? The whole idea of phenomena is that it is a representation of what's real. I don't have the opportunity now to sort of really give you the full philosophical discussion of this, but phenomena is a representation. It's part of the structure of what's real, but all we have access to is the phenomena. Now, there's discussions of this. Some people say, no, all that there is phenomena. Some people say, no, that phenomena is representation, and there still is some real that we could potentially access more. I'm going to get into that. But the idea is, we now as subjects, what do we inherit from Descartes? We inherit ghetto-style sort of philosophy. We inherit the primacy of the subject and the recognition that representation plays a huge role in our epistemic accessibility. Okay, so this is being I. It is this conception of the monopoly of truth by means of the scientific method that postmodernists challenge the very conception of truth, right? And the idea, again, as I said before, was there are many alternative vehicles, many alternative modes to accessing truth, and science and the scientific method is one of many. In terms of race theory, we recognize then, since we've put primacy on the subject, and now we recognize that via Descartes, that representation influences, he says, and the primacy of representation, the influence of representation in our lives, that we can constitute a very antagonistic relationship. It sounds bad to say constitute an antagonist. It sounds really ominous to say that, but I probably shouldn't say it like that. That we can understand antagonisms, racial antagonism. And part of racial antagonism at its root, at its base, and I like this idea, this is take it beyond West now, but you borrow some of his concept and you hybridize it. But he makes a very, very good point. At its root, racial antagonism, at its base, racial antagonism is about a discrepancy over the primacy of subjective identity. I believe that my embodiment, that my subjective identity is better than yours, is smarter than yours, is more meaningful than yours, right? So that we take this concept of subjective identity and we attempt to, as scientists have, in terms of any number of taxonomic systems, as in terms of any system to order or organize groups, we say that my representation of subjective identity is better than yours, right? And this is, I mean, it's like, when you say it like that, it sounds like, you know, like this is like, you know, your kids might, I mean, when you say it like that, it really sounds trivial as hell. Like race antagonism sounds very, very trivial. My subjective representation is better than yours. But that's really what it is, right? At its base, that's what you're saying. You're saying that my mode of existing as human is a better, a more authentic mode than yours. You're mimicking my mode, or you're a deviation from my mode, but my mode of existing, my mode of representing human beings is best. So what do? They deny your humanity. They say that you don't properly represent the mode of being human, right? You don't properly represent what it is to be a human. For those who racists believe are humans, they demarcate them. Well, you're a human, but you know you're a little bit less, you're a little bit less, you're a little bit less, until you reach the point at which you've lost your humanity, and the dredge are at the very bottom. Really sort of fallacious, sort of hyperbolically unrealistic, profoundly, overwhelmingly delusional. But the idea is it's very simple. That's why it's so powerful. That's why race antagonism is so powerful. Because all you have to say is just that. Like, my identity, subjective identity, the way I look, the way my hair looks, the color of my eyes, is better than yours. It represents true, authentic human existence better than yours. It's about as simple as it comes in terms of concepts. Obviously, because we see this. I just, as a quick side note, I saw 42, the Jackie Robinson movie, and there's a scene where, you know, they're playing baseball and a little kid is in the stands with his dad. Jackie comes out to go hit the ball, and you can tell initially the little kid was like, wow, this is going to be cool, let's see if he can play, blah, blah, blah. And he loves his dad yells out, nigger, nigger, nigger. And you can see immediately the kid's perception started to change. Immediately it starts to change. It was well shot. It was amazingly well shot. Because very little, almost nothing was communicated from the boy initially. But you can see, based on camera angle and all this other stuff, good actor in the child, that you saw real time his face, you saw him change. Real time. It was amazing, actually. Because when I think about it, it looks almost like real life. He no longer sees Jackie Robinson as representing an American going to, you know, first base. Not first base, going to the pitcher's, to the batting mound, right? He doesn't see him as a human. Initially, it probably would have been, yeah, this is an American, he's going up there to play ball, let's see how good he can hit. Dad says, nigger, nigger, nigger. Everybody in the audience says, nigger, nigger, nigger. And the kid recognizes, he believes falsely, that maybe I'm being naive. Maybe there is something about this guy that I don't yet see represented. Maybe there is a threat in him that I don't yet see represented. And what do? You use the term nigger as a means of distancing yourself from that possible representation. Right? Nigger. And what does the boy do? He yells it. Nigger. Of course, Jackie, he goes to do his thing. But in terms of representation, yeah, we'll see this later. It's more than just skin color. It's far deeper than skin color. Right now, even as deep, and this isn't that deep, this is sort of middle grade in terms of intellectual ability. This is like middle grade deep. But what we'll see later is that the representation becomes a signification. Right? We'll transform the language of representation into a semiotics of signification, and we'll see what the signification points to. And I'm going to do this in the next section. I'll tell you just a little bit now. It points to a threat. It points to violence. It points to the rapists. It points to crackheads. It points to gangbangers. It points to any number of things. If you're not an individual who is embodied by that representation, which will become signification, who's embodied by that signification, you would never understand what it means to be me. To have a PhD and teach at a university that grants PhDs, which is the culmination of this whole process. I mean, it's as big, not in terms of as grand as it can get, but it is the culmination of your academic career. And then to live in a world, despite the fact that you publish multiple books, and despite the fact that you do articles, and despite the fact that you do hundreds and hundreds of hours of lecture, to know that, or to believe that, people still look at you like a thug, like a real legitimate gangbanger. You can't understand that until you're me, until you're black. You can't understand what it feels like to be a doctor, but despite the fact that you're a doctor, you're still a nigger, and you're still a threat, because there's something that's being hidden. It's just a matter of time before it's found out, and then we'll prove that, knows who we were right. You can never understand what that feels like if you're not from a group of people who live that daily, because unfortunately what ends up happening in terms of this cartoon, and shout out to Wes for just being so freaking awesome, and he's right. What ends up happening is so much is placed on both subjectivity but on the representation. And since this black skin, especially coupled with these tattoos, represents something in the world real, especially in the United States of America. You see a mugshot of me, you see me in a beater with some tattoos tatted up, and you're going to think to yourself, oh my God, what is that guy? If you don't know who I am. I know who that guy is. I can tell you his story. Despite the fact that I haven't been that person and I never will be that person, it's really almost a daily battle to be like, hi, don't forget, I'm welcoming and I'm friendly and I'm not going to kill you. No, I don't want to mug you. No, I never killed any. You know, it's obscene, but it's part of the power of representation, right? It's part of that power. So, huge point. Bottom of page 6. The postmodernist position, however, was arguably derailed by the classical social affair. Just a real brief explanation. I don't want to get into modernist and postmodernist critique, but the idea is in terms of the modernist critique, as we've said, the modernist critique is situated within the rise, the sort of the establishment of scientific enlightenment, and all that constitutes that. And I spoke about that at length. The postmodernist account is an attempt to acknowledge the power of science. It's not to deny. I think some people take this too far. It's not to deny the power of science, but it's to also talk about. Yeah, I'm trying to give also a good account of postmodernism. In general, it's an attempt to offer alternative accesses, alternative routes to truth, so that science constitutes one of many approaches, methodological approaches to truth, which is true. I mean, it's obviously true. So there's some good bits in postmodernist thought. When postmodernists take it too far is when they make the very fallacious and laughable assumption that even science, and I know postmodern, I'm going to get, oh my goodness, because some people are very wedded to postmodernism, so I got to be careful. They're their own little cult. And I don't mean to say that disparagingly, but some of the most heated graduate discussions I've ever had to do with postmodernist theorists. There's a part of postmodern, let me put it this way. There's a part of postmodernist theory that I just don't understand. I think that's a better way of putting it. And it's the assumption that even scientific discovery and scientific fact is itself socially constructed. That scientific truth, there is no truth that transcends social construction, is probably the farthest way, I would also say the most perverse way of articulating postmodernist views. And this is notoriously, and I think perfectly highlighted in the Sokal affair. So Alan Sokal is, I think he's New York University maybe, NYU, I think, physicist. So you just say NYU and you say physicist and you get an idea how smart this dude is, right? So NYU physicist who gets tired of social theorists talking about postmodernist theory out of context because they mimic physics. They don't really have, they have access to the discursive bits of physics and they create strawman arguments out of the discursive bits that they know, but they don't really, social scientists, don't really have access to the non-discursive aspects, the know-how, because they don't have their own independent physics labs. So he gets pissed off and he gets tired of social theorists talking about sort of the social construction of the gravitational constant, if you will. That, seminal, basic facts of mathematical physics are open to social construction is completely ridiculous for him. And for most rational people now, obviously me as well, it's ridiculous. So what does Sokal do? He writes this article, sends it, I think it's a Journal of Sociology. But the problem with Sokal, though, is that he makes peer review that much harder for people like me. But still, shout out to Sokal, because we should have rigorous peer review. But it's a consequence of his actions why it's so hard for me as a scholar to get published and others like me. But I think he did the right thing. I know he did the right thing. And what he did was he fabricated an entire article. And the article basically talked for the social construction of sort of math and physics. That it was all malleable, it was all changeable, it was all contingent on norms and linguistic communities. Facts which definitely account for our social relations, but not for physics. Journal of Sociology, it's been years since I actually read this, but to my knowledge, to my recollection, Journal of Sociology appeals to his name, appeals to his university. This guy's a physicist from NYU, run with it, publish it. And they publish it. And as soon as they publish it, he says, you guys are basically a bunch of morons, this is fake. I wanted to show that I could get it published because you would make that appeal, but none of this is real. And you can imagine how humiliating. I shouldn't have laughed, but it's so genius. He's so genius. And you can imagine how humiliated the journal was. They were. You've undermined everything. You've undermined everything. Intellectual credibility is out the door. I know he didn't do it to sort of debase or defame the journal itself. His intent was to demonstrate, and he did it perfectly, that listen, you stay in your field. Talk about social theory and social relationships with respect to society. Don't try and take, just like you don't want physics and science applied to social relations, nor do we want social relations applied to science. There might be some overlay, there might be some interchange, but the idea is this is a mode of accessing knowledge, just like social theory is a mode of accessing knowledge, and the attempt to try and take tropes from social theory and apply it to science is problematic. So that extreme end of postmodernism becomes problematic. I think the parts of social postmodernist theory that's completely fine is the critique that sort of scientific dogmatism, as it's known, right? This dogmatic approach that science accounts for everything. Our genes, our social relations, who we're going to become and people and our intellectual ability, that aspect, the scientific dogmatism, will collapse just like religious beliefs. I wouldn't say collapse, but religious beliefs lost its sort of global power with the turn of scientific enlightenment. It will collapse just like scientific dogmatism resulted in the collapse of European nihilism in Europe. Thus, over here, we have to recognize, via postmodernist critique, that science is one avenue, one vehicle to arrive at truth, but there are any number of other vehicles as well. Okay, so lastly then, the classical revival. The classical revival is an aesthetical revival, and it was very interesting to read, not a lot to write here, but what ends up happening in the classical revival via West is we see sort of Michelangelo, we see the great artists, we see the great painters, we see the great taxonomers, Da Vinci's sort of taxonomy of the human body. All of these essential artists wedded their aesthetical methodology to the images portrayed in antiquity. So it was one of proportionality. It was the proportionality of the nose. It was the bone structure that we saw in images like the statue of David and such, just to be sort of cliche. But that physiological representation that comes out of antiquity becomes the template with which we arrive at our collective social sense of aesthetical beauty. That becomes the referent. And insofar as that image and those images, these proportions, to be technical, because he talks about the proportionality of any number of things, become the referent for our collective sense of aesthetical beauty, both in Europe and in the States, then deviations from that aesthetic now are legitimate means of dehumanizing another. So if the nose is supposed to have this sort of angle and it goes too far out, well, see, you're a few degrees out of aesthetical beauty. And if the lips are supposed to have this particular texture and this particular thickness, and the lips are too full, then you're that many degrees. So now I can use science, right? Because now I can start to measure, pseudoscience. Now I can start to measure, and I can start to account for deviations from some standard. Obviously, this is completely ad hoc. Obviously, this is completely arbitrary. It isn't so much the ad hoc nature of these attempts at pseudoscientifically marking deviations from some norm that's of any importance, because it's clearly ridiculous, and I'll send you some links later in the lecture series. What's more important is the recognition that it was through an aesthetical, this is the point, it is through an aesthetical account and justification for beauty, as per the notions of beauty and the representations of beauty in antiquity, that we have arrived at a global structure for legitimizing white supremacy, right? Anything outside of these norms are devious. Any deviations outside of these norms undermine an individual's subjective humanity. And thus, you know, you're more bestial, you're more animal, you're more ominous, you're more evil. You think of just one last point before, in terms of evil, because I was like, evil? No, evil. In terms of Nazi Germany and depictions of Jews, not just to say blacks, Jews were always drawn with horns, right? The Jews would have some horns, have these huge noses, they'd have tails, right? Africans were always hairy and bestial, big lips, and we'd be looking like monkeys, right? So it was sort of that representation of a black person as a monkey, or a Jewish person as a devil, as being, you know, forked tongue, as being, you know, cloven feet. That representation for Jews and blacks was a means of distancing our physiology, as diverse as it was, our physiology. It did not conform to this sort of pure aesthetical beauty, and we reaped the repercussions. And others, I'm not just saying blacks and Hispanics, I mean blacks and Jews, Hispanics, Asians, everybody, right? But I'm, you know, just within the context of the lecture, those are the two groups of people that came to mind. So you get the idea. So we're going to look at scientific, what we're going to do in the next section is we're going to take this and we're going to apply these three modes of, what does he say? How does he identify it? He calls it the three historical processes. We're going to identify how these three historical processes, with respect to scientific revolution and enlightenment, with respect to Cartesian emphasis on subjective embodiment, and with respect to an aesthetical account, how these three categories, historical processes, apply to our contemporary understanding of race and racism. And I have to give, again, a shout out to West for it, because I would not have had a conceptual means of tying these narratives in together. It was in the processing of the notes that I recognized, no, this is a really good approach, right? This is a great way to sort of understand the fundamental, sort of foundational basis for racism in America. And it really is, I'm sure there's more. I don't think he's presenting these three as exhaustive, but these three are a very, very good way of establishing a theoretical structure for race antagonism and race relations in the U.S. So with that, I'm going to end the section 1.1 of my lecture series into race and ethnicity. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. Have a good day.